Welcome back to Celebrity Radio. It's Alex Belfield talking to some of the world's biggest stars and some of my favourite people. And today we have a legend and an icon. They first met in 1975 in Las Vegas at Caesars Palace, and they went on to work together through endless tours and singles and created some of the greatest songs on earth. Vincent Falcone was born into music. It's what he was meant to do. He's travelled the world, directing some of the greatest orchestras and playing the piano for stars including Tony Bennett and, of course, the great Frank Sinatra. So to celebrate his life and career, I called him at home in Las Vegas to talk about the birthday of Frank Sinatra. He would have been 100 years old on the 12th of December 2015, and I began by asking him about his life in music and dedication to his craft.
I was introduced to the piano by a friend of my mother and father's who was a music teacher who sensed some talent in me, and at the age of 3 she started teaching me by rote to play piano. So I have very little memory of any time prior to my being exposed to music, but I never considered making music a career, a way of making a living, because when you grow up in Syracuse, New York, you can't make a living being a musician in Syracuse, New York. So I decided in my late 20s, early 30s to move to Las Vegas and see if I could make it. And that's how it developed for me.
The amazing thing about you is you've travelled the world performing with some of the greatest orchestras in the world. Do they differ massively? Is it all down to the talent of the musicians?
Well, of course. The musicians, you have to look at it two ways, and I don't want to sound egotistical in any way at all. I know what I'm doing, and I learned from Mr. Sinatra what has to be extracted from the music if you want it to be as good as it can be, and therefore you have to be able to communicate that to the orchestra. Now, not all orchestras are at the same level. Obviously, if you play with the New York Philharmonic, that's one thing. You play with the London Philharmonic, that's one thing. But if you play with the, and I'm not going to say any particular speaker, that I don't want to insult anybody, but let's say some small town symphony orchestra that doesn't meet those qualifications, you can't just stand there and beat their heads. I mean, you have to try to encourage them and try to get them to play as well as they can play, and you have to accept the best that they can do. But you can only get the best that they can do if you encourage them and you give them something to strive for, and that's what I try to do.
When I see you sat there behind that piano with the orchestra in front of you, it seems like you're living every moment and still enjoying it. Do you ever get bored of doing the same stuff over and over again?
Oh, no, never. Because, first of all, I'm sure you're aware, we do make, in any show that I ever do, we always make changes from time to time. Even when I was with Mr. Sinatra, we wouldn't change much in the show, but we would change things to keep the interest up, keep the orchestra interested, particularly in a long-term engagement. But I never get bored. No, this music that we play, that we perpetuate, the Great American Songbook, is some of the greatest music ever written. So to be bored with it would be kind of foolish.
Do you view your success as being blessed or lucky, or do you see it as hard work paying off? Because the people you've worked with are extraordinary, but then again, the talents you have are remarkable.
It's a combination of both. You have to have some talent, and it's God-gifted, so you can't take credit for it. But then you have to work at it. You have to recognize that you never become perfect. You have to always work at it. You have to always strive to become better and learn from others who are better than you at certain things. So you constantly have to do that. And the luck situation comes in, where in my case I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time to have Mr. Sinatra hear me, and the rest is history. If I hadn't been there at the right time, who knows? Maybe I would have met him somewhere else. Maybe I wouldn't have. But the fact that I did, there certainly is a bit of luck involved there.
You moved to Las Vegas in 1970, and there you were at Caesars Palace, being their house pianist, and Sinatra heard you. Do you remember that meeting, and do you remember what he said to you?
He said nothing to me. I remember the meeting like it was yesterday afternoon. As a matter of fact, I initially played for him only when he was at Caesar's Palace for the first few months. And then he took me on the road with him. That was an amazing thing to me, that I would actually be one of Mr. Sinatra's musicians, but I wasn't yet conducting. I remember when he finally did say something to me was one time we were rehearsing at Caesar's, and his next engagement was going to be in Syracuse, New York, which was my hometown. And, of course, I wasn't yet traveling with him. So I said to him, Mr. Sinatra, may I speak to you for a moment? He said, of course. Wait, what can I do? What do you want? I said, and I explained to him, you're going to be in my hometown. My mother and father tried to buy tickets to come and see you, but you're sold out. And he said, wait here. And I did. And a few minutes later, Billy Rizzo, who was his associate, came out of the dressing room and said, you got 2 tickets. Your parents have got 2 tickets to the show. So he went into the dressing room, called whoever he had to call, and made sure that my mother and father got to see his show, although it was not with me. That came later. But that's the kind of man that he was.
Yeah.
And when he did get to know my parents, he treated them wonderfully. I have nothing but the greatest respect for the man. We all have faults, and certainly he had some too. But as a man, I have nothing but the greatest respect for him.
I've heard Don Rickles interviewed. I've interviewed Frank Sinatra Jr., and I've asked them all the same question. Was Frank Sinatra a nice man, providing you were on the inside? I guess the answer is yes.
Unquestionably. I mean, Don Rickles is a close friend of mine. I in order to do the show with that you saw in Las Vegas, I had to leave Don Rickles. I was his music director for the past year and a half prior to the show that we did in here in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Sinatra loved Don. We all know the kind of man that he was. We all know the generosity that he showed. Certainly he had a temper, but his temper usually was reserved for those people who deserved it.
Yes. How intimidating is it saying, could we try that again, Frank? Did you ever do that, or did he know when he needed to do it again?
I would not tell him that way. I'll give you an example. When we were doing Trilogy, the third record of Trilogy was the Future, which was all original material written and orchestrated by the great Gordon Jenkins. And we're in Mr. Sinatra and I spent almost a year privately, the 2 of us, helping him learn this material that he had to do, which was all original material about him, but nonetheless it was all original lyrics, original melodies, things he had never heard before. Now he had to learn all of this in between our engagements. So when we got to the recording session, there were times when I knew he could do better than he had done in a particular tape. But I would never go up to him and say, hey, Mr. Sinatra, you didn't do that well, you better do it again. I would go up to him and I would say, hey, Mr. S., why don't you go into the recording studio and go into the booth and listen to that take and see what you think. Go in and listen, and then he would come out and he would say, let's do another one. And I'll tell you, at the end of that recording session, that was the end of the 3 records, because we did that one the third. That was the end of the almost a year of recording. I was collecting the music, and when I went out to my car, he was standing out there waiting for me, and he put out his hand to me, and he said, "Thanks, kid."
Wow.
And I knew what that meant, and
Yeah.
that was one of the proudest moments of my life. So whenever it was something that I thought he could do better, first of all, he pretty much knew when he could do things better than he did. As an example, when we recorded New York, New York the first time, he wasn't happy with it. And so when we did the next recording session, we recorded it over again, and that's the one that you hear on the record. He just felt he could do it better. He knew most of the time when he didn't do something as good as he could. But if I heard something that he wasn't particularly aware of, I would mention it to him, but in a very respectful way.
You're now going to put the phone down on me because I'm going to ask you some terrible questions. Things like, what was Sinatra's best song?
Oh, that's an impossibility. They just got better. They just kept getting better all the time. There was no... listen to the way he sings "Summer Me, Winter Me."
Yeah.
will tell you this. Now, this is my opinion, so I'm not saying that this is actual. I'm just saying it's my opinion. I believe I met Mr. Sinatra when he was 60 years old. He had just turned 60 in 1975. That's when I met him, and that's when I started working for him. And he was 60. He was a mature man. He was out of his youthful, what we all go through. I believe that even though his voice wasn't as pure at that time as it was when he was in his 40s, his interpretation of the material was far more introspective than it was when he was younger, and that he re-recorded and did in concert songs that he had recorded so much superior to the way they were on the original recordings when he got to that age. That's why I am so enamored with the Trilogy project, because he was in his 60s when we did that, and She Shot Me Down, and his interpretation of that material is just ridiculous. It's unbelievable. And when he recorded, it was a very good year. If you listen to the recording of it, was a very good year. It's wonderful. But if you ever heard him sing it in person, take your breath away.
Really?
So, that's the way I see him. And as a favorite song, I don't have one. I have a group of ones that I like more than others, but I could never pick out one favorite. There's just too many great performances.
This week I interviewed Judy Garland's daughter, Lorna Luft, who I was talking to her about Frank. He was her godfather, and I said, was there any greater deliverer of lyrics or person who could do phrasing? And she said no. Would you agree, of all the people you work with, was he master of delivery?
No question about it. As an example, Bob Anderson, who you know was the star of the show that you saw, Bob realizes that no one can do what he did. It's just, he just had a way about it. I mean, Tony Bennett is great. Tony Bennett's one of the greatest singers of all time. Jack Jones is an incredible singer. They would admit, and they do it, that no one interpreted lyric the way Sinatra did.
As you sit here now and you look back on the last 50 years, do you still pinch yourself to think that you got to be so close and work with and influence and be part of the Frank Sinatra legacy? I mean, his music will live on forever. People are never going to get bored with it. Do you view it as a privilege, or is it sort of another life? Does it even seem like you at this point?
No, it's definitely a privilege. I must say that when I see videos on TV of Mr. Sinatra and myself back in the 80s, I look at myself and I figure, who is that guy?
It's your grandson.
But no, I mean, a privilege is it's more than a privilege. I can't even begin to tell you what it meant to my life. I wouldn't trade my life, my experience that I've had as a result of being with him. I wouldn't trade that for all the money in the world.
By the way, I noticed you never call him Frank.
No, he was a year older than my father. I couldn't call him Frank. I couldn't call Count Basie Bill. He told me to call him Bill. I said, I can't do that. I mean, I have too much respect for those men.
Wonderful.
Count Basie, William Basie was another icon in the American history. He was an incredible man, incredible musician. But, no, I couldn't call him Frank. No way. No way.
Do you have a favourite venue? Was there one concert that stuck out as the best, or do they all sort of become as one at this point?
Well, there were several. Carnegie Hall, of course, is one of my favorite. We performed there many, many times. It's just breathtaking. In England, Festival Hall, Royal Albert Hall. One of the most remarkable things I ever did with him was a concert at the Pyramids in Egypt.
Oh, wow.
The orchestra was set up on the base of the Sphinx.
Wow.
I'm conducting the orchestra and looking at the pyramids, 5,000 years old. I went in the pyramid. I went into the pyramids, went up to the top. I mean, that concert will live in my mind forever.
Were there ever shows where Frank felt he didn't deliver? Were there shows that could have been better, or were they all of a standard where you walked away with your head held high?
We all walked away with our head held high, but that doesn't mean they all were as good as the others.
Right.
He knew when he wasn't as good as he should have been. I always know when I'm not as good as I should be. But that's the thing that makes you strive to be as good as you can. He said one time to me, he said, if we're not great, we damn well better be very good. And I understood that. If you ever get to the point where you think that you know it all, you're finished. You're done.
Yeah.
You got to learn every day until you die. You got to learn something every day.
Is it not true, though, Vinny, that when you're at the point that you're at and Frank was at, your average is still extraordinary?
Oh, well, I mean, I can't take credit for that. But certainly the people for whom I work, always their average was way above the norm. I mean, everybody that I work for whom I work.
Did it ever become normal walking in a room and seeing Sinatra stood there? Did you ever feel he was just a friend, or was there always sort of a gap between you and an intimidation? Did it ever become normal?
Oh, he and I were very normal. I mean, we talked about, he told me things, frankly, I didn't want to know.
Wow. But I love that. That fascinates me, Vinny. And to think that you had that privilege of knowing him on a human level is so wonderful. Obviously, Frank had many relationships through his life. I suppose you saw them come and go.
Yeah, I did. Of course, when I started with him, he had just married Barbara, and he was with Barbara for all of the time and the rest of his life. And but I met many of the women that he had known in his earlier life, and heard what they had to say about him. But I'll give you an example of how fatherly he was to me. One night he took me to 21, which is a very famous restaurant in New York City. Yeah. Very, very famous. Yeah, I'm sure you're aware of it.
Yeah.
And we're sitting there, and the waiter comes over, and he says to the waiter, he looks at the waiter, and he points with his head towards something, and the waiter knew what he was saying. He said, go with him. He tells me to go with the waiter.
Right.
I get up from the table, I go with the waiter, we go into the elevator, we go down these stairs, down to the basement. We come into the basement, so he takes me up to this wall, which was just a wall, and he reaches up and he touches something, and the wall opened up. And we walk into another room. And in this room is where all of those famous people that I just mentioned to you had their collection of wines. In the other room, the main room, was just all of their wine for the hotel. We go into the special room where he has all of these collection of wine, and he tells me that this room was the room that they used during the Prohibition, when drinking was illegal in our country, and they would serve liquor, but they had to keep it clandestine. And this room was the room. So he wanted me to see this, and he told the waiter to take me down there. I mean, the only reason he did that was because he cared enough about me. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of relationship that I had with him on the most part. I never called him Frank. I called him Sir. I called him Mr. S. I called him Boss. Yeah. But we had in my view, a very close and personal relationship. He was very good to my family, my children. He told my father once if he needed anything to call him. I felt that I got to know him pretty well.
To think that next week he would have been 100 years old, and for much of his career you were working with him and you were part of his life. Are you proud of the way his legacy has been protected? Because his music still speaks louder than anything else. His legacy is enormous, and the mystique around him is as intriguing today as it has ever been. Very few people can say that.
Well, that's true. Once again, I tell you, the first 60 years of his life, I didn't know him. I must tell you a funny story. When I was in the Army, I was stationed in Europe, in France, in Orléans. And I used to go to Paris a lot because I loved that city. Yeah. And on my time off and what have you, I would go to Paris. And one day I'm walking down the Champs-Élysées, and I see on the theater the sign, 9 o'clock tonight, Frank Sinatra. So I go to the box office to see if I can go to see him, and I can't afford the ticket. That was in 1962.
Wow.
13 years later, I'm working for him.
Good Lord.
And one day when we were together in the dressing room, I said, "Hey, Buzz, I want to tell you a story." And I told him that story. You know what he said to me?
Go on.
He said, "Why the hell didn't you call me? I'd have got you."
And the Don Rickles story about, could you come in while I'm dating this girl and say, hi, I'm Frank, and Don says, can you go away, Frank, I'm busy. Did that really happen? Because it's one of the greatest showbiz stories in history.
It did really happen, and I'll tell you why I know. Because it was told to me at different times by both Don Rickles and Mr. Sinatra.
Oh, I love it.
And it was, I've got to clear up a couple of things about it. That the generality of what you said is true, but not the specifics. When Don came into the restaurant with his girlfriend, he wasn't married at the time.
Right.
Mr. Sinatra then came in with his entourage, and the girl went nuts. And,
Oh.
Don said, "Oh, I know Frank, you know." And she said, "You know him?" She said, Can I get to say hello to him if you know it?" Well, now Don's telling me now. He says, "Now I get nervous." He said, "Because I didn't know him that well." He said, "But I got up from the table and I went over to his table and I said, 'Hey, Frank, my girlfriend is really enamored and she would really love to meet you. Would you, at your convenience, do you think it would be possible for you to come over?" He said, "I was so polite to Frank, you know." So now Mr. Sinatra's telling me the story, and he says, "Yeah, I figure, you know, what the heck." So he gets up from the table and he goes over to Don's table and he says, "Hey, Don, hi, Don, how are you doing?" And Don didn't even look up. He says, "Frank, can't you see I'm eating?" Well, Mr. Sinatra said he literally crawled out of the restaurant because he loved that kind of humor. I mean,
Yeah.
He loved Don.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of guts that Rickles had and still does. But and that story was told to me at different times by both of them, so I know it's true.
Well, my two favourite nights in a theatre this year, one was seeing Don Rickles in October in Las Vegas, and the second was seeing you with Bob Anderson at the Palazzo. It was one of the most magical shows I've seen. I was not blessed to meet Sinatra, but that concert and that orchestra I thought was sensational. Congratulations on it. It really was wonderful, Vinny.
Thank you. And I would love nothing more than to have the opportunity to recreate that at Royal Festival Hall someday in England.
I could talk to you for literally